Thanks so much. So I'm going to try to share my screen. I am probably the last person in the world that is new to Mac devices. So it's a learning curve for me, but hopefully you all are seeing my screen now and my slides. I will tell you more about myself in a minute, but I actually want to start with a brief overview of Talent Market. So we are a nonprofit organization that provides free consulting and search management services to other free market nonprofits. That essentially means that I spend very many hours each week, not only reviewing resumes, but also getting pretty candid feedback from hiring managers, which gives me a pretty unique insight into the topics that we're going to be covering today, which is broadly best practices for resumes and cover letters. So we'll start with resumes. We will talk about what to include, what to hit delete on right this minute. We'll talk about cover letters and how they can become your greatest tool for success in the job search process. We'll dive into a little bit about general do's and don'ts when applying for roles, how Talent Market can help you. And then finally, I will hopefully leave plenty of time to answer any questions you may have. You're welcome to use the Q&A feature throughout the session. I will try to catch any questions you have in the moment, but if not, we'll definitely answer them at the end. One thing I do want to say is that job advice is often based on personal preference and can vary pretty wildly from person to person. There really aren't many hard and fast rules, and a lot of my experience and thus my advice is centered specifically on applying for and getting hired into roles in the nonprofit sector. So if that's not your path, there are definitely some areas where standards differ in other industries, but for the most part, these are generally accepted best practices. And even if you don't follow every tip, my goal is for you to end the hour with at least a few actionable ideas on how to improve your resume and your cover letter. But before we got into that, I wanted to tell you just a little bit about myself. I grew up in an incredibly small town in Oregon. I moved to another very small town in Oregon to go to college. And then I packed up my bags and I headed to DC to work in the Liberty Movement. And if I were to draw you a map of the first 10 years of my career, it would probably look pretty similar to the graphic that's on the screen. I spent the first few years working in policy and pretty quickly realized I hated working in policy. It was very solitary work and I really love people. So I did a big 180. I started exploring people-centered roles. And for the past 5 years, I've had really a variety of outreach and engagement type of roles, including my job now, where my favorite part is absolutely connecting with early career folks like you all to talk about how to be successful in your career. Finally, and this is totally a personal pitch for myself, I spend a lot of time listening to podcasts and I'm always on the hunt for new ones to get into. So if you have recommendations, please email them to me, tweet them at me, send them in smoke signals. I will be very appreciative for any recommendations you have to give. But before you start thinking of those recommendations, let's go ahead and get into the meat and potatoes of today's subject. And I think that there's probably no better place to start than in addressing some of the things that I hear most frequently. I know you can't shout out your answers, but I'd love for all of you to take just a few seconds to think about which of these statements you think are true and which you think might be false. Okay, hopefully you all have your answers in your head. We're going to talk about each of these more in depth, but very quickly. This first one, length absolutely matters. The most commonly held belief is that you absolutely cannot go above 1 page, especially early in your career. I think that's really important advice to heed. The second one is an often quoted statistic that I see accompanied by some really poor advice to do things like keyword stuff your resume and your cover letter. The truth is that there are some systems out there that take a little bit of the human touch out of the hiring process, but this statistic is completely made up, and the percentage is probably very much lower in reality. And then this last one is kind of false. So it is based on a single study. And again, it became wildly popular to quote when giving resume advice. It might not be totally true, but the thing is that I think it can be a really helpful mental model regardless. And here's why. So even if a recruiter or a hiring manager is spending more than 6 seconds looking at your resume, they definitely are not going to strain themselves to try to decipher your materials. So what this means for you is first and foremost, no novels. And if that feels painful to you, try to keep in mind that the longer your resume is, the less likely hiring managers are to see the parts that you most want them to see. It also means that you can use formatting to your advantage. So the graphic on the screen here is demonstrating what's called an EPattern reading tendency. We know from some pretty cool sciencey studies that as people glance over resumes, their eyes tend to follow almost exactly a capital E pattern. So as you're formatting your resume, think about how you can leverage this pattern to arrange your sections and your headers where the eye is already most likely to be drawn. Because at the end of the day, what you're really trying to do is catch the reader's attention just long enough so that they really pause and pay attention to the entire document. So let's talk about how we get to that beautiful, readable, single page masterpiece story of yourself. The first thing is that it doesn't need to be a 5-paragraph essay. I know we spend a lot of time growing up practicing our 5-paragraph format, but your resume is not the place for that. Again, we're really going for readability and quick comprehension, and bullet points are great for both of those. One of the mistakes that I do see most often is inconsistent punctuation at the end of bulleted points. So it doesn't really matter if you want to put a period at the end of every point or you don't want to put a period at the end of every point, but make sure whatever you choose is consistent throughout your entire resume. As far as layout, there are really 3 required sections on your resume. They're contact info, experience, and education. So we will go over some tips for what to include and how to format each of those sections individually. So let's start with contact info. The first thing that is really important to remember that I see people forget a lot is to include your contact info on every single page of your materials. So if you are submitting a cover letter, a resume, writing samples, references, your contact info needs to be on every single one of those pages. It's super helpful for hiring managers when they're going through your materials, especially if they accidentally get jumbled with other papers or misplaced or put out of order. So save the hiring manager some headache and make sure you have it on every single page. What to include there, definitely your name, address, phone number, and then permanent email. We highly recommend not including school emails or organizations and clubs that you're affiliated with. It's also important to make sure that your email is professional. So if you came up with your email address when you were a very witty 13-year-old, you might want to double check and make sure that it still fits at this point in your professional life. A couple of things that we've seen with more frequency that are still generally frowned upon, including things like headshots or social media handles. LinkedIn might be the exception here, but really what it's doing is taking up space that you can use for other things. And especially as you progress in your career and real estate on that single page starts getting pretty competitive, you're going to want to trim things that are not absolutely necessary. The last thing I want to say here is about address. So I have seen a lot of people suggest, especially in political spheres and nonprofit DC think tank kind of spheres, that if you're trying to get a job in DC, you should borrow a friend's local address or in some way hide the fact that you're not already in DC. I absolutely don't think you should ever lie to an organization that you're trying to work with. That's just not really the best way to start off a good working relationship, but especially with address. You don't want it to be the case that they call you up for an interview tomorrow because they think you live 2 miles east, but really you live 6 states away, and you're going to have to tell them that you lied on your materials, and they're probably not going to want to interview you anymore. So some things you can do, you can note that you are planning to relocate, open to relocating, and you absolutely can address your location in your cover letter and make a compelling argument for why it's not actually a knock against you, or you should still be considered even if it will take you longer to relocate across the country. The next section that is on resumes is experience. So here is where you're listing all of your relevant work experience, including your internships. You can include volunteer experience or significant leadership roles. As your experience grows in your career, you can always move volunteer or other non-paid work experiences into something like an other section, or I've seen a lot of like civic participation sections on resumes that I think work perfectly fine. When you're writing this section, you really want to use those punctuate action verbs. Those are the words that are going to highlight what you achieved. So things like motivated, created, facilitated are much more compelling than really task-oriented words like helped or worked. Those words don't really demonstrate how or even if you accomplish the task that you're talking about. So try to really jazz up the language in this section in particular. As far as formatting your experience, it's pretty easy. You want to make sure that the organization and your title are really easy to pull out when you're glancing through the page. You also want to make sure that dates are really clearly there. Dates are very, very important. You should be as accurate as possible in listing the dates. And then in your bullets, you want to highlight major accomplishments, evidence of problem solving, other achievements that you had in that role. One piece of advice that I do always give is to focus on quantifying those achievements. So saying something like you organized 15 events per year with 200 attendees each is much more compelling than just saying organized events, right? So as you're building out this section, really think about those areas where you can incorporate more quantifiable achievements. Again, we're not going for over exaggeration or overstating your achievements. We're just thinking about how to try to make it as compelling as possible. The next section on your resume is usually education. Again, we're focused on making the most important things really easy to find. School name, degree, grad date. That's basically all you absolutely must have here. If you're still in school, this can go at the top of your resume. That's where we see it most often. After graduation, you usually move it to the bottom of the page. You can include your GPA, but for very many reasons, I recommend not doing that. I have never seen it make a difference in a hiring decision or a candidate decision in my line of work. There are some areas like if you're going into the legal profession where law school GPA is very, very important. So know the norms in the industry that you're looking at, but unless you have a 4.0, and even if you do have a 4.0, in most cases, it's not going to help you. And it's going to really age down your experience level to the hiring manager to see it still listed there. So be thoughtful about whether or not you want to include it. Um, Sometimes it's helpful to have a final section that's something like special skills. If you want to include those and they're relevant to the job, I say go for it, but be very thoughtful. With language in particular, I really want to emphasize fluency. I know a recruiter who's known to switch to Spanish in the middle of interviews if it's listed on your resume as a competency. That probably won't happen to you, but you definitely don't want to get caught off guard with something like that. Other things to put here, definitely put specialized computer skills and software if they are relevant and listed in the job description. So if you have special skills in a research method or a research program and it's in the job description that you need that skill, make sure that it's somewhere on your resume. As far as what not to include, my one dream is probably to never again see a resume list Microsoft Word as a special skill. It's not necessary. It's pretty much assumed at this point that you know basic word processing skills. Um, it's again taking up real estate that is really valuable, and you can probably put something way more important in that space. The same goes with soft skills like public speaking or teamwork. Really, if you've got demonstrated professional experience leveraging those skills, make sure that you're communicating that somewhere in your experience section. Okay, so when you have brought it all together, let's talk about how to package your resume. The first thing is that if it's digital, always do a PDF. When it's in a Word format or a Pages format, it can and often does open differently on different computers. And you don't want a hiring manager to open up a document and have it super garbled, and it's too much of a headache for them to really decipher, right? Um, the same goes for your margins. So a lot of people will try to game this one-page resume rule by pulling their margins all the way out. Make sure that you've actually left enough of a margin all the way around that it prints well. Even if you are submitting your materials digitally, I know a ton of hiring managers who have a strong preference to print out those materials so that they can make notes, so that they can read it more easily. And again, if they go to print it and it's super very hard to fix it for you. If you are going to a hiring event or somewhere where it's appropriate to do things like give people your resume, make sure
Hey everybody, I think Stephanie is having a little bit of technical trouble, so we will just wait for her to come back on. But until she logs back on and is able to join us again, I'd love to tell you about fee products and fee things that we have to offer. If you all aren't familiar with Out of Frame, we have a series on YouTube that basically takes topics such as economics and things like that and sets it to pop culture. So if you are not familiar with our Out of Frame series, please make sure to check that out, and I will drop a link in the chat. Stephanie, do we have you back on the line?
Yes, it says I can't share my video.
Okay, let me just fix that for you.
There we go. Okay, I am so sorry. I think at this point, we're all pretty used to weird tech issues happening. But let's just jump right back in. Okay. Hopefully you can see my slides again. Okay, we still follow the 10 years per one-page rule. I don't want to harp on this too much, but it is one of the only rules when it comes to doing resumes and formatting them well. Okay, proofreading. If you are using past tense verbs in your experience section, make sure that you don't slip back into present tense. I see that a ton. It can be really helpful to have someone else review your resume specifically for this. A copywriter friend of mine also once told me that it can be really helpful to read it from the bottom up to catch mistakes. I tried this. It was super helpful for me. Maybe you want to try it for yourself. I really cringe for people who make mistakes like describing themselves as detain oriented or as exceptional communicators in a resume full of errors. I will very embarrassingly admit that early in my career, I was called out on a typo in my resume in the middle of an interview, and it was very embarrassing. I still think about it now, 9 years later. So please don't be that person. My heart will hurt for you, and it is super easily avoidable. One of the best tips that I've ever been given is to take the time to create what's called a master resume. So here you are creating a version of your resume that is as long as your heart desires. You list every accomplishment and every achievement from every one of your single past experiences. And then you use it as a base template for each job that you are applying for. So what you're really gaining here is the ability to leverage your knowledge of the organization or the company you're applying for and the specific role that you're applying for to pull out what things make you most compelling for that specific role. One thing to note here is that it is much easier to do something with this level of detail if you are keeping your resume up to date all the time. It's just pretty hard to go back and try to recall really finite details of an internship or experience you had 2 or 3 years ago. It's generally also just a good idea to keep your resume up to date, even if you're in a role that you are super excited to be in and you're really happy and you're not planning on leaving. You never know when an opportunity is going to present itself, or you will be approached with something that you're really excited about. And having your resume and your application materials just kind of up to date continually helps you when those opportunities come up. At the end of the day, if you're being really thoughtful about this, and you should be really thoughtful about this, you're going to end up with something that is highly scannable, it's compelling, it's a detailed look at your best attributes and your best accomplishments. But it is often the case that your resume doesn't really tell the full story about you, right? It's a single page that lists things that you have done in your professional life. And that is why you'll often be required to submit a cover letter in addition to your resume. And oh man, I love a good cover letter. I swear I get really giddy when I read a genuinely good, compelling cover letter. But the vast majority of cover letters that I read are not genuinely good. So before we talk about the do's and the things that I love and hiring managers love, let's talk about the don'ts. And there are quite a few of them. So the first thing I will say is I don't recommend starting with a generic or a base cover letter that you just repurpose over and over again. But if you are going to do that, make sure that you replace all of the places where you mention the particular role, the organization, the hiring manager's name. If you read your cover letter and you can use it to apply to literally any role, you're probably doing it wrong. Um, it's really an opportunity to show your passion and to show your excitement about the specific role you're applying for. And you should absolutely take the time to use that opportunity to your advantage. People tend to treat cover letters as an opportunity to sell themselves, which is absolutely true. That is one use for a cover letter. But you want to make sure that you don't focus so much on yourself that you forget to mention why the organization is awesome, why you're excited about this particular role, why you are qualified as a candidate outside of just being really awesome. So when it comes to specific language, phrases like "I am the perfect candidate" or "you will not find anyone better than me." I have never seen a candidate who has used one of those phrases or who has told us that they are the most perfect actually get hired for that role. And there is absolutely a reason for that. If that phrase appears in your cover letter, this is one of the things that like you should pull it up right this minute and delete it right now. It comes across as very braggadocious. It comes across as you're assuming you know everything about the role, everything about the organization, and everything about every other candidate that's applying. And it's probably not the case that you have that level of clarity or detail. And at the end of the day, it's not up to you to make those decisions. It's up to the hiring managers and to the leaders of that organization. On the opposite end of this, you also don't want to go on an extended diatribe about how you know you don't meet the qualifications, but as a person, you're really great, so they should just go ahead and hire you anyway. You're most likely wasting the hiring manager's time, and they will most likely hit delete on your application pretty quickly. There are other and better ways to make connections with organizations or companies that you might be interested in working with. And I absolutely recommend pursuing one of those other methods, not just applying to any open role that they have, regardless of if you are actually qualified for that particular role. Okay, so we talked about what not to do. Let's talk about the things that your cover letters should do. It absolutely should reflect the fact that you have done your homework about the opening and about the organization. So take the time to write a thoughtful, business formatted letter that is tailored to the specific position that you are applying for, and it will be very evident to the hiring manager that you've done that. Here are 5 things that it should absolutely include. The first is the job. This might seem like Captain Obvious, but make sure that you actually mention the job that you are applying for. Include the specific title. Some organizations are simultaneously hiring for multiple roles in the same department. So you don't want there to be any confusion or area for misinterpretation of what you're actually applying for. And then if possible, it's always nice to tell the organization how you learned about the opening. Number two, tell them why you're interested. Again, I'm sure you got the picture from the pitfall section, but to be sure, you should explain why you're interested in the role. And don't forget to detail how you are aligned to the mission or the vision of the organization. And don't be afraid to show your passion for what they're doing. I almost guarantee you that the person doing the hiring is also really passionate about their vision and the work that they're doing. And they will be excited to see someone that shares that passion and wants to contribute to it. Number three is to include why you're qualified. So here you want a really brief summary of why you're qualified for the role. There is no need to rehash your entire resume. So you don't want to say, my most recent role was X, I did Y and Z. Prior to that, my role was X, I did Y and Z. That's what your resume is for. Your cover letter gives you a chance to really just hit the high points that are really targeted to this specific role. Number four is special requests. So if the application instructions ask for specific things like salary requirements or start date availability, make sure that you include those things in your cover letter. Neglecting those requests really just irritate hiring managers, and I don't think anyone really wants to deal with irritated hiring managers. So make sure that you go back before you submit your application and double check that you've addressed all of those additional things. And then number five is clarifications. So you should use your cover letter to explain things that don't necessarily belong on your resume or things that appear on your resume but might need some additional clarification. For instance, you may want to mention why you're on the job market, or you might want to mention or articulate whether you're willing to relocate, why you've had a gap in your job history, stuff like that. There is a good opportunity on your cover letter to address things that might give the hiring manager pause if they just look at your resume. One of the best pieces of advice I've gotten and really easy mental models for really what to do with your cover letter is three parts. It's here's why you rock in addressing the organization. Tell them why you think they're awesome and why you think what they're doing is awesome. Then you want to say, here's why I rock, which is here are the experiences and the aptitudes that I have that make me qualified for this role. And then you want to make sure you address, here's why we would rock together. So hopefully that really simple, easy three-step process helps you to remember to include each of those sections when you are writing your very specific tailored cover letter for each of the roles you're applying for. Okay, so before I wrap up, I wanted to zoom out and talk very quickly about applying for jobs in general. Again, some of these things might seem very obvious to you, but they are mistakes that I see so often, so I wanted to address them here. The first thing is to read instructions very carefully. Make sure that you've included everything that's required, but I want to caution that you are not being helpful by sending things that have not been requested. So writing samples, letters of recommendations, references, if they have not been requested by the hiring manager, please don't include them. Honestly, there's almost no potential benefit here, and there is a lot of risk. If and when the organization needs that additional information or those additional materials, they will absolutely ask for them. And it's great if you have them already ready to go and to send off to them. Just don't do that unsolicited. The next thing is to not be squirrely on salary. We all know that talking money is tough. We feel weird talking about it. But if you are asked to give a range for your salary, either on an application form, in your cover letter, in an interview, you have to give a range. that range should include numbers, not words. And absolutely, you should not say something like, it's negotiable. That's frustrating to hiring managers. And at the end of the day, you don't want to go really far into this process, and the organization doesn't want to go really far into this process if you are on completely separate pages about the opportunity for compensation in a role. So if you get to the offer stage and they offer you something that is just not tenable for you and your lifestyle, it's going to be really disappointing on all accounts, and everyone's wasted their time, which is why we try to get clarification very early in the process if we think that it's possible to meet your needs. So give a number. Make sure that you're thoughtful about that number. Don't undersell yourself. Don't say something like you want $120,000, because I think we all do, but early in your career, that's probably not very realistic. But absolutely don't ignore that requirement or that request. A note on following up. It is totally fine to be persistent. It's great to be persistent and to show your enthusiasm about opportunities. Please try to have realistic expectations here. The average role at Talent Market takes a little more than 70 days to fill. That is on the lower end of average for all jobs in the US. It takes a long time to hire. It's a really long process. I know it can be frustrating as a job seeker because you want money and you want stability, but you have to have patience with the process. So if you start pestering organizations 3 days after you apply because you think there should already be a decision, I have some bad news for you. And it's that the hiring process takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of patience. And you don't want to label yourself as somebody who's unrealistic or who just really doesn't understand the norms here. I also want to mention that there's a difference between being slightly underqualified for a role and being wildly out of your league. So stretch roles are great. They're the roles that might be really challenging for you. You might not have all of the qualifications, but you think that you can genuinely create value in that role. You should apply. You don't have to meet 100% of the criteria in order to apply for a role. But you should not apply for roles that are wildly far from your abilities and the opportunity that you would have to do a good job in that role. It's unlikely that if you have 3 months of work experience, you should be applying for roles with senior in the title. So be thoughtful about how far you stretch and how far outside of the qualifications you're willing to apply to roles for. And then finally, what I think this all comes down to is being very cognizant of your professional reputation, especially if you're looking at working in public policy or the liberty movement broadly. You will hear again and again how small the liberty movement is, how small DC is, and it's absolutely true. If you make yourself known as having poor judgment, as not being professional or not having good judgment here, it will follow you. And we really don't want that. And we think that there are really easily avoidable faux pas that hopefully at this point, you've got a better idea of what not to do in this process. So here are my absolute final thoughts, I promise. Always be truthful in your resume. I talked about this with addresses, but more broadly, don't embellish your accomplishments. Don't stretch employment dates. You do not want to get caught being less than 100% honest. And hiring managers absolutely will take you out of consideration if they start to get the sense that you've over embellished your accomplishments. So try to avoid that. I know that the standard format for resumes looks boring. It looks kind of outdated. You might have gone to Etsy and seen some really cool new types of formats and templates that you can use, and they might look really cool to you. As someone who looks at resumes all the time, I love the standard format. Most hiring professionals love the standard format. And it's because we know exactly where to look on the page to find the information that I need. And at the end of the day, it might not look as cool as some of those newfangled templates, but you're trying to make it as easy on the hiring managers, on the recruiters as possible. And the standard format really does that. And finally, just be you. I'll be honest in saying that people ask us all the time, what's the secret formula or the magic phrase that will guarantee you an interview or guarantee you a job offer? And the answer is that there's absolutely not one. It's really important that you are representing yourself as you are and being authentic throughout the hiring process, so that at the end of the day, if you get the offer, you really know that it's going to be a good fit for you, it's going to be a good fit for the organization, and everyone is going to end up creating more value in the long run. Finally, get connected with us. So if you are a current student, we have a ton of resources on our website at talentmarket.org. If you are on the market or will be soon, I encourage you to send us your resume. We will notify you about open roles we think that you might be interested in. And outside of that, I'd personally love to be a resource for you. So feel free to email me or connect on LinkedIn with me. If you'd like me to take a look at your resume, I am always happy to give some strongly held opinions and quick feedback. So you are welcome to send those to me. And with that, I will shut up for a bit and ask if you all have questions or thoughts about anything I covered, any other topics related to jobs and professional things. And of course, podcast requests are always welcome. One thing that I will say is that if there is something on your mind right now, if you are really curious about something, I can almost guarantee someone else is also wondering the same thing. So I encourage you to do them a favor and go ahead and ask about it. Okay, there is one question. Any particular advice for foreigners living permanently in the US with a green card and looking for better opportunities? Should that be mentioned in the cover letter or somewhere in the resume, or should I wait to bring that up in an interview? I'm definitely not an expert here, but I will say that for the most part, if you think that it's a barrier to you advancing in the job process, you might want to find a way to work it into your cover letter, especially if you don't need sponsorship. I know that that's something where there's a lot of unconscious bias in the hiring process, which is unfortunate. But outside of that, usually it's totally fine to wait until you're farther along in the process to talk about what needs you may or may not have. The only thing that I would say outside of that is to pay particular attention when it's mentioned somewhere in the job description or the requisition, if they have specific requirements around citizenship status and whether or not you need to certify anything like that. Next question, what advice for young people without much content for resumes, like recent high school graduates? I think this is an awesome question. I don't read as many resumes for folks who are that early in their career, but I would say that it's the same for current students who are applying to things like internships, which is really find a way to highlight accomplishments, even if they are not paid work accomplishments. Get involved in your community. If you're not already involved in your community, find ways to volunteer or to contribute and really grow your skills and your aptitudes. If you're involved in school activities, in sports even, I think there are really great things that you can pull out of those experiences to demonstrate really important job competencies like teamwork or perseverance, stuff like that. So just be really thoughtful about how even non-paid experiences do contribute to demonstrating the skills that you think are compelling for the roles that you're applying for. One thing that I will say is that when you're that early, so if you are still currently in high school or very young, folks get nervous that they don't have enough on the page. And so they do things like blow up the font size or put in really weird spacing. You don't want to do that. I think it really calls attention to the fact that you don't have a ton of experience there. And so stick to the standard format, even if it doesn't take up the full page. But I think if you really take time to think about it, you can get at least 3/4 of the way there. Next question from Lauren. How much of our cover letter should we repeat in the actual email we're sending the cover letter and resume in? I don't want to repeat myself if I'm not supposed to. I think this is a super awesome question. This is something that has always made me very nervous when I'm applying for roles. There's something about what you put in the body of that email that's always seemed very intimidating to me. My best advice is to keep it pretty simple in the body of the email itself. I think it's totally fine to say something like, hi, this is my name. This is the role that I'm applying for. Attached, you will find all of the required materials. I am super excited to be considered for this role, and I look forward to hearing from someone soon. Thanks. Here's my name again. That's as much as you need to put in the body of the email itself. And then really that compelling case for yourself and your qualifications should exist in the cover letter. The reason for that primarily is, one, the hiring manager is probably not really paying attention to what you wrote in the body of that email. They're just going to click on your attachments. And two, anyone reviewing your materials later probably doesn't have that email pulled up with them at the time that they're reviewing it. So you don't really need to be that concerned about the email itself. Okay, next question. Any advice for a long-term entrepreneur looking to branch out and finding employment in an unrelated field? What areas or accomplishments do you reckon could be emphasized beyond a working interest? This is an awesome question. One of my favorite statistics from the work that I do is about 65% of the roles that Talent Market fills are with candidates that had previously not worked in the nonprofit or liberty advancing world. So we see a ton of folks that get to a point in their career where they have had really great careers, they've had really fulfilling careers, but they're looking to get more involved in mission-driven work or be in roles where they're more passionate about the work that they're doing day to day. And so it's absolutely possible to make that transition. I think the biggest piece of advice I can offer is to make sure that your passion for the work is really clearly outlined there. Especially for folks that are pretty advanced in their career, it can be hard to see how some of your experiences translate to the roles that you're now applying for. And so I think being very thoughtful again in the cover letter, in your resume, really clearly drawing it out for the hiring manager, for whoever's reading it, why all of your past experiences lend themselves to the role that you're applying for is going to be the most helpful thing you can do. Any other questions? All right. I don't think we have any questions left over, but I will once again put in a pitch for getting connected with Talent Market. We would be really excited to connect with you, talk more about what you're interested in, how we can help you. My contact info is up here. You are welcome to email me, get connected with me. And then I think the last thing is that Fee would love your feedback for this session. I would love to hear your feedback for this session. So I think Morgan will share a link to that feedback form, and we would be super grateful if you would take the time to share your thoughts.
We have one more question in the chat, which is a really good one, about liberty oriented job fairs. If you have time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great question.
That is an awesome question. So there are a couple of different resources that I would recommend getting connected with. For a job fair itself, I think the Heritage Foundation is probably the only organization I know that does like an actual job fair. They've moved those online for the foreseeable future. So if you're not in DC, those are still accessible to you. Outside of that, the State Policy Network has a job board. Talent Market has all of our open roles listed publicly on our website, and the Heritage Foundation's Job Bank is probably the most comprehensive collection of open roles at different organizations that advance liberty and free market principles. So if you're not connected with all of those things, I highly recommend checking them out. If you need help getting connected with those things, feel free to email me and I will send you links.